Charles Domes says, or asks, daughter is a freshman at COE in CID Intro to Philosophy is philosophy and science fiction. But no, Asimov has. Okay, sorry, I'm having a hard time following this one. Okay, so there's a daughter's taking classes on philosophy and science fiction, but there's no Asimov, no Heinlein, no Frank Herbert. Comment? Yes. The comment is that your daughter is getting ripped off, and well, technically speaking, you're getting ripped off. They're going to be shown substandard material based on the color of the skin of the people that wrote the story. That's where we are now. They're gonna chuck away the kind of deep science fiction that caused people to think very seriously about issues, and that's all gone. Shakespeare's gone, Twain is gone, all of them gone, because identity politics says that not only are they not worthy because of who they came from, we obviously have to have room for other writers of color and whatever else you want to say. My feeling is, hey, if a writer of color writes an amazing piece of science fiction, then that should be taught, like everything else. But just doing it because of the color of their skin strikes me as an incredibly racist and demeaning and self-defeating argument too. What I mean by self-defeating is it's like saying, we're not going to teach Shakespeare in literature anymore. We're going to teach, the only one I can think of is Maya Angelou, and I'm not a super big fan of hers, but in any event, you get the idea. What they're basically saying is, we're gonna force you to listen to a philosophy from a writer who was not able to convince people on their own that the philosophy was worth sharing. So Shakespeare is Shakespeare because it's excellent, and you don't have to be British to enjoy Shakespeare. You don't even have to speak English, although I cannot imagine what Shakespeare in other languages it sounds like. Shakespeare in German must be quite a surreal experience, I would imagine. But we're going to basically say that what they're basically saying is the reason we're going to take away these classic authors and replace them with our authors is because nobody reads our authors. So we're going to make you read them. And all of the things that people have been reading for hundreds of years because they have such value, you're not going to read those anymore. Not allowed to. And this is how they are convinced that this is how they're convinced. See, you know what? This is the whole thing. And this is the whole thing with what we just talked about with Star Wars and so on. This is the major point. The left thinks that culture goes into people and turns them into something. When in point of fact, it's the people who do things that then create the culture. It's not the other way around. The culture doesn't create people. People create the culture. They're convinced that if they can change the culture, they can change people, but it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. And this is their big, enormous, gigantic mistake. And the catastrophe is that we've been letting them get away with it. They think that if they change Star Wars, they'll change people. But Star Wars didn't create people. People were already the way they were, and they liked Star Wars. They're attracted to it because it made sense to them. These people are such absolute idiots, and they're such mean-spirited, and they're so lazy, you know? That's really it. They're just so damn lazy. It's hard to write a best-selling novel, and it's hard to write a really excellent play, and writing 30 of them is much harder. And so if you're so lazy and so barren and devoid of talent that you can't produce something that has merit on its own, then you just simply get control of a university and you make sure that nobody reads the stuff that people want to read and everybody reads the stuff that you wrote or that your friends wrote or that the people you admire wrote, even though they clearly don't have the same merit. Because if they did, you wouldn't have to force people to read them. So somebody in the comments section, Dave Big Booty as usual, says, Shakespeare in Klingon, I would be willing to bet you that Shakespeare in the Klingon language is better than it is in German. or French for that matter. And by the way, why is Klingon an actual language? I mean, you can take classes in Klingon. It is a completely filled out language, has its own syntax, its own vocabulary, all of that. So why is that? Why are people around the world able to converse in a fictional language from a group of people that never existed? Why? Well, for one thing, the Klingons were iconic. They were iconic. They meant something bigger than, oh, it's just another guy in a rubber suit. It's the Klingons were the warrior caste. That's what they were. And they were all in on the warrior thing, and their language reflected that, and people were so entranced by the idea of this warrior culture that people who this idea of warrior lifestyle appeals to decided, hey, why don't we just fill out the language? Because Klingons sounded like what Klingons would say. If you take a Klingon and you give him a language that sounds like French or like the Elvish language, and it's something very soft, the Lutharian, and then they're not Klingons anymore. Has to be. It makes sense. It was internally consistent. This is why it worked. This is why there's a language that you can learn, because it made sense, because it sounded like what these people would say, and we know what these people would say is because they've been so well fleshed out over the course of 40 years that we know what Klingons do and don't do. And apparently, there's, because I didn't watch it and I'm not going to, but Picard, Star Trek Picard, has two house servants out at his little chateau, and they're both Romulans. And you see they're like housekeepers. One of them is cooking for Picard, and the other one's kind of like a butler and dressing him and all the rest of it. They're Romulans, and you see this, and you think, I didn't know there were beta Romulans. I mean, I didn't know that there were Romulan wimps. I didn't think that there were any Romulan toadies or anything. These people are servants to this Earthman, and they're going to tell all the backstory. Well, Picard saved him, and Picard. It is the destruction of the idea of Romulans, who are stoic, proud race of people who would much, much rather die than surrender. And now these idiots have them cooking Picard's dinner. Probably they'll have him washing their feet too. And he looks like a beta male, this Romulan, He's got kind of this receding hairline and kind of thing, and he looks kind of like, he just looks like a Romulan hairdresser, let's just say that. Right? And so he's not a Romulan, and he's not a Romulan, and I understand that Romulans are a false species, that they don't really exist. They are metaphorical, they're iconic, and they carry a meaning. They're stoicism. They are all of these alien races take human qualities and go all in on one or two of them. So the Romulans are unemotional. I'm sorry, the Vulcans are unemotional, the Romulans are stoic, the Klingons are violent, and that's the definition of the race. And so that's why it worked. But when you start doing this kind of thing, you just completely destroy it, and these idiots think that people will still buy it. It's like, yeah, sure, of course we have a bunch of hairdresser and graphic designer Romulans who are working for this Earth person who they despise, but they don't despise him, they look up to him. Then they're not Romulans. And that's just, there you go. So I'm sorry that they're not teaching Heinlein. Obviously, they're not teaching Heinlein, because if they taught Heinlein in school, you wouldn't have any progressives anymore. But I wish I could tell you I'm surprised. Just give them the books to read, Charles, and just tell them, pick it up and see. All right, so